Cape Japper. He did the Cape Japper. Yeah. He said to me, he said, how would you like to block on the line? He said, I'll give it to you.
Rightio. Well, thanks everyone for making it along again this week. So I went through all of your assignments that have been submitted on Friday, and I've marked everybody. It appears that for some people the grades are not actually coming up there. So if you need to speak to me directly about it, that's fine. Overall, sort of excellent, really. Pretty good, both internals and externals. Very happy with that. A couple of people, there's a few things left to touch up on. So if I've said that in your assignments, come and see me afterwards. We can work through. Okay, this is what we need to do. This is what we need to have a look at. Yeah, I guess.
So is it a grade or was it pass, fail?
It's only pass, fail.
So if you got completed, that means it's completed.
No, if you got completed, that means it's all done.
Oh.
Yeah. So completed means it's been all done. Incomplete means it's not all done, basically. And that's the only way we're allowed to grade. Until everything's finished, then we can go competent, not competent. Yeah. Or competent with limitations. All right. And there's one or two still yet to hand up as well, so have to get cracking on that. So we will have a bit more of a cracking session today. In terms of got to finish off the timber structure and envelope, touch on roof trusses still, and then push on to cover roofing today. And if we do well enough, then we'll get into masonry as well. So we'll finish. What's that?
Oh, we covered roof trusses.
Oh well.
Yes or no?
Yes, no. So we had a bit of a discussion around the model, but I have a bit more of a discussion about roof trusses in general. Yeah, look, if it is getting too much repetition for you, please let me know. So this is where we're up to last week in regards to pitched roof framing. So some of it will be a little bit of revision. So strutting beams are required to strut off of when we don't have an internal wall frame to strut off of to help support our underpurlin, which helps support our rafters. That's the interaction there, and the size of the strutting beam is calculated by the amount of roof load that it carries. That roof load is determined by half the distance between, well, half of this roof space here, basically. So from our top plate up to our ridge, half that distance, and then also half the distance between this strut and that strut and this strut here. So everything is divided up. So the roof load in this direction is divided up between those 2 points, and it's strutting the central section, and then divided up between our struts as well. So there's a decent diagram showing what that strutting beam is doing. Hanging beam supports our ceiling joists to ensure that we're not spending a whole lot of money on buying large ceiling joists. We break that span up with a hanging beam. That hanging beam is also supported by a counter beam when that hanging beam gets too long, to ensure that we don't go spending too much money on really large hanging beams. Another important point that's shown in this diagram here is that counter beam is packed up off the wall frame slightly. What we don't want to see happen is, well, there's always going to be deflection of materials to a certain degree. Even concrete, when you build a skyscraper, that concrete at the bottom of the skyscraper actually compresses. So there's always going to be compression and deflection of materials to any extent. With our counter beams, because they're actually taking a fair bit of weight through this hanging beam, we have to pack them up off the wall frames to ensure they don't interact with our ceiling plane, because that's the last thing we want. is for any deflecting counter beam to go pushing on the ceiling and putting our ceiling out of level. So some more terminology there to remind you. So we've got our ridge, got our hanging beam heading through, supporting our ceiling joists, our counter beam, which is supporting the hanging beam. And this is a diagram showing that interaction between the hanging beam, the counter beam, and the ceiling joists. So our hanging beam running perpendicular to our ceiling joist, picking those ones up. That counter beam with blocking attached on the side of it there to help support our hanging beam. And then our joists supported off that hanging beam by cleats. And in here it's given that you should have 25mm clearance between the bottom of your counter beam and your ceiling. And combined strutting hanging beam, that's where we've got a beam that's supporting ceiling joists, and then also we're strutting off of that. So as you can see in this photograph, it's a fairly large beam. But all of that, the size of those are determined by reference to the stand tables in the timber framing code. Also, whenever we do, well, how do I say it? I certainly don't expect you guys to go out and design bracing. I think I may have said that before. Bracing is one of those things that is integral to a building standing up. Yes, it is fairly well explained to an extent within the timber framing code, not thoroughly explained within the timber framing code. So there are limitations on the bracing design you can do via the timber framing code. But that bracing helps make the building resist racking forces. It's one of those important things to get very correct, because if you don't get bracing correct, then you get interactions happening within your frame that are essentially detrimental to the structure of the building, and you can have structural failure. And it's one of those things, because it's included in the wall frame, you can't just go in and add some more bracing later on if required. So if bracing is designed, bracing has to be designed correctly. Well, as
something that an engineer would normally do in their charter as opposed to a building designer.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So so for the engineering firm that I worked for, after a while they'd get me to do the bracing. Like typically it's what the structural engineers do, but they will pass that off onto the drafters and so on when they see that okay, they know what they're talking about. What's that?
When it's not complicated, they just
Exactly. Yeah. When it's and when it can be covered by timber framing code, etc. When it's called first principles. When things are not covered by a particular code, then the engineers have to go back to what's called first principles and design from those, which is basically interactions between and the various different strengths and properties of your materials, to say this 30 by 0.8 gal strap can take this sort of load with this sort of fixing, etc., over this type of run and this type of angle. So they will go through the engineering calculations to work that out specifically when it's not covered by a particular code. And so when you've got bracing, tie downs, various different supporting systems that aren't covered by codes, then engineers do have to design that. And typically councils will want to see those engineering calculations as well.
So what happens when councils change the spec? Like, when we built our house, they actually changed the specs on the wind category that our house was in.
Right.
And the engineers, I thought that because our house was all the planning's already been in, that nothing would change. But apparently the thing had to be re-engineered and more ties added in.
Yeah, and that's exactly what has to happen, and that's not the first time I've heard of that either. It's never happened to me, where a council has gone, no, we determine the wind speed to be this as opposed to that. Yeah. It's never been contested for me. Haven't ever dealt with that myself, but yes, I've definitely heard of that happening before, where someone's put in stuff as N3. Councils come back and go, no, wind classification here is N4. We've determined it as N4. You have to design
Yeah, I
it
think
as
there
N4.
were more drawings and sheets of paper than there were actually the metal scrap.
Yeah. So and sometimes it can be a very straightforward process to upgrade. Certainly, yeah. It's all once again it's all very case specific. So
who bears the cost on that? So, you know,
the
if we
client,
plan it.
not the client, wears the cost on that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, basically that's it. If you want to build the house, you have to. Well, short answer is if you want to build the house, you have to get approval for it. The council are the ones that give you the approval for it. If they, if they're confident in giving that approval as you put the plans in, well then it's all fine. If they're not, well then it has to be reworked. That's pretty much the way it goes, in a nutshell. So with our I think I explained it last week. I don't have a gable end roof here to show you, but hip end roofs, they provide some bracing simply by our hip rafters there being on an angle. They provide bracing in that roof, and so there's less bracing requirements for a hip end roof. However, a gable end roof, so roof without any hips, that's just straight up and down, because it acts like a sail, because it's copying that wind, it requires more bracing within that roof structure. Typically, when we're talking about roof bracing and using the gale strap, it's really not an expensive product, and it's not very time consuming to put in. It certainly in this instance it pays to be a little bit more generous with your bracing. On top of our rafters, supporting our sheeting, we've got purlins, and the spacing of those purlins, the type of purlins, etc., are going to be dictated by typically by the type of sheeting we put on the roof, and also by the size of the gutters that need to go onto the roof. So the size of the gutters, that's going to be determined by the amount of roof which is going into those gutters, the length of roof which is feeding in. We're also required to have downpipes at maximum spacings of 10 metres as well. And at times the spacing of your downpipe is going to dictate the size of your gutter as well. Typically your purlins are, well, it says here 70 by 45 pine. Once again, that's dictated by the spacing of the purlins. We express our purlins as actually, typically we express our purlins as 45 by 70 as opposed to 70 by 45. 45 by 70 tells us that the purlins... Oh, sorry, wrong. The purlins are on edge, battens are on flat. So our purlins specified as 70 by 45, our battens are specified as 45 by 70. So that's the one in there that's wrong. So when we get a small number preceding a large number, we know they're on flat. When we've got a large number preceding a small number, we know they're on edge. Oh. When they're on edge, they're purlins. I knew
there was a reason for it, I couldn't.
Yeah. And that's the difference between our battens and our purlins. And typically battens are used for tile roofing, but also I'll quite often specify sheet roofing as battens as well. So that's your timbers on flat if the spans are going to be possible. Possibly, I don't have a piece of timber here to show you. Maybe a bit of a revision. When we've got a timber member, let's just say that's a piece of timber. It's a piece of steel, right? Say it works exactly the same way for all intents and purposes. Like this piece of steel is going to span further than if I put it like that. Because when we increase the distance, but the depth of something, we increase its spanning capabilities per cross-sectional area. If we tip it on its side, it won't span as far. The issue with producing something which is really tall and really skinny is, yes, it'll span further, but then it doesn't have that lateral strength to resist any sideways forces. And if you have any eccentricity of force, well, then that can fail in that direction there. But that's what plays into that decision of whether you specify something as battens or purlins. In here we've got some eaves details. So eaves are important because they both shade our windows and protect our walls from moisture and weather. Helps with the longevity of the building, helps with the comfort of the building. The most common is a boxed eave. So this is what we call a boxed eave, where we tie back into our frame. The reason a boxed eave is quite popular, well, there's several reasons a boxed eave is quite popular. It's very, very simple, very clean, but also it helps to support our rafter. So as our rafter carries on over past our top plate, we tie back into the frame here, we've created a triangle. Triangles are a good strong structure. That triangulation helps to support our rafter, which means that we can create longer eaves than if we didn't tie this back and we had our rafters cantilevered. That is probably the largest factor involved in determining the size of your rafters. And the size of your rafters relates directly to the expense of the roof. So you can save yourself a decent amount of money by boxing your eaves back, tying your eaves back to the wall frames. But it's not an aesthetic for everybody, and it all comes down to those decisions made through the timber span tables as to how far you can create your eaves on what size pieces of timber and what that's going to cost. So with a boxed eave, overhang is flush on the underside and similar to a ceiling in a room. With a raked eave, you will carry, and typically your eaves lining is going to be a fibre cement sheet product. That way it's fireproof and it lasts outside. It's durable. With a raked eave, your fibre cement sheet follows either the underside of your rafters or is slotted between your rafters, and you have quarter round dowels to cover those gaps. So standard eaves widths are 600, 450 or 300. You'll notice that throughout building is we deal a lot in increments of 150 millimetres, and those numbers of 600, 450 and 300 come up quite often. And we'll get into that a little bit, well, what plays into that a bit later when we touch on masonry. So this is our raked eave, and it's a fairly good detail. That's all. It's all really very very standard. So that one's for a tiled roof. What's to mention from that? Well, this one's got a bird board in here between our rafters to ensure that no vermin, no animals can get up inside the roof space. What else? Yeah. Also, this one's got an anti-ponding board as well. So underneath our tiles, we always have to use sarking because basically tiles leak. They leak water. If we've got rain coming down and a strong wind heading back this way, water can be blown underneath the tiles. It gets in, and then that sarking collects that water and makes sure it gets back to our gutters. So that sarking is lapped down into the gutter to help ensure that water gets there, and also to ensure that the sarking just doesn't sag. Just here in front of our fascia, you have an anti-ponding board there to help that water make its way all the way down into the gutters.
So is the sarking only there for the tile roof?
No, so it's a good idea to use sarking under a sheet roof as well. You don't have to, but yeah, it's a very cheap form of both ensuring that, well, providing a second layer of protection against water, and also very cheap way of doing a reflective foil insulation to help guard against radiant heat. So a lot of the heat that comes through your roof is as radiant heat, so it heats up the sheeting and transfers into the ceiling space. I think we showed this. Actually, no, we didn't show it on the models yesterday. So this is with a gable end. To create a gable end, that's, well, for an overhang with a gable end, that's created by what are called outriggers. Those outriggers are pieces of timber that are in the same plane as your rafters. Those outriggers have to be designed to have 2/3 backspan to 1/3 cantilever. So with our sheet roof, our rafter spacing is at 1200 centres. So, well, at 1200 centres max, but typically it's always just going to be at that 1200 centres. Can anybody think what our gable overhang then will be on a sheet roof? Our maximum gable overhang?
600.
600, yep, exactly. And if you want to create a gable overhang of over 600 mil, what you've got to do is you either create another rafter which is set down, and then with that rafter you've got some bit of funky framing that brings the end of your rafter up to the same height as your fascia here, and you carry those outriggers past a first rafter which is set down lower into either your next rafter, which is a very expensive exercise because then you're going back 2400 mil, and you've got then, and that's if you're wanting to create more than 600 overhang. Let's say we want to create an 900 mil overhang. To create that 900 mil overhang, if we're going back here 2400 and then 900, we are at 3.3 metres for a piece of timber there. Our timber comes in lengths of 6 metres. So that's, very expensive way of going about it. What you can do in that scenario to create a 900 overhang is have your first rafter set in at 600 from there, and then 1200 from that, giving you an 1800 backspan, 900 cantilever, which is 2700. Two 2700s out of a 6 metre length of timber gives you 600 noggin left over at the end, or 600 piece timber. So it's thinking about those details that enables you to essentially build in an efficient fashion. It's understanding that you need to have that backspan, and then also think about the interaction of the size of your outriggers and how that meets in with your rafters as well. So a little bit of terminology here shown. We've got our fascia on there that picks up our gutter. The piece of timber here, which looks very much like a fascia, is what's called a barge board. That piece of timber, it may be exactly the same piece of timber. It might be 180 by 32 mil LOSP. But that one's called a barge board, barge or verge rafter, as opposed to the fascia, which carries a gutter. Then our top plate here of our framing that creates the gable end is called the raking plate. So raking because it's on an angle. Between our outriggers we have solid blocking for several reasons. One, because our outriggers are going to be on edge and we don't want them to be turning over, so that solid blocking helps to turn them over. It also just helps seal up that wall frame, up at that top section. Then further back here, we've got our common rafter, we've got our collar tie holding our roof together, we've got our ceiling joist also joined to our rafter, coupling the roof. We have our top plate here from our wall frame and our ridge board. Then on this section here, this one's also got an underpurlin there, which our collar tie is mounted just above. Oh, one more thing. I made quick mention. I think we've covered this already, but it's a bit of revision. I made mention that your fascia and your barge board are going to be H3 LOSP. Does anybody remember what H3 LOSP is?
H3 is strength in timber.
No,
Well,
yeah.
great. Well, 1, 2, 3, so 3 is a better grade than 2.
Well, yeah, okay, yeah, no, good. So with all of our timber, it comes under hazard classes. For our standard framing indoors, we can use hazard class 1 timber. Hazard class 1 timber is timber that can be used only indoors and it's not termite resistant. H2 can be used indoors but is termite resistant. H3 is timber which can be used outside that's exposed to weather.
So how does the hazard come into the...
So the hazard class that's the class of hazard that the timber is going to be exposed to. So hazard class 1 indoors, hazard class 2 indoors subject to termites, hazard class 3 outside in the weather, hazard class 4 in the ground, hazard class 5 in wet ground, and 6 in marine. Yeah, exactly. So our outriggers, because they're all covered by the roof sheeting, and we're probably going to have an eaves lining on the underside of that, they can just be your standard MGP 10, your standard machine graded pine. But because our barge boards are going to be continually exposed to the weather, and also they're going to have water dripping on them from the various different flashings and whatever, and our fascias, they're going to be exposed to the weather, but also they've got to collect a little bit of moisture in behind the gutter. You can't, that can't really be avoided. They will have to be treated with what's called LOSP, which is light organic solvent protected. I don't have any LOSP here to show you, but I'll just quickly do a Google search for LOSP, and I think many of you, when you see it, you go, "Oh yes, I've seen that sort of timber being used about the place." Yeah, that's our typical colour that it comes in. Has anybody seen timber in that baby blue colour like that before? I'll just quickly flip through some more. You also see it in pink. But yeah, that's another good one as well. So that sort of, LOS, when you see timber in the timber yard like that, that's LOS, that's light organic solvent protected timber. As a side note, it should not be used internally. So I don't know exactly what's in the light organic solvent, but it's not particularly good for your health. And so it's recommended that it's not used inside. There are various different stain sealings and whatever you can do, but basic note is it shouldn't be used inside. So that was the remainder of our truss roofs. Sorry, our pitched roofs. Now we'll have a quick look at trusses for the next half hour. So trusses have been a fantastic invention in enabling very large spans that provide uninterrupted spans. So we don't have to have any columns inside to hold them up. So it enables things like these medieval cathedrals without internal supports. Probably the structural engineers or the engineers in the room could tell me that this is probably not really what we class as a truss. Is that more of a geodesic dome structure? Yeah, which works on different principles essentially, doesn't it? Because it's more about everything being under compression and transferring that compression to, yeah, so yeah, not truss, but definitely truss and truss. We'll get through that fairly quickly. So rafters, the traditional approach to span between things. Then to increase those spans, things such as trusses have been invented. Trusses have to be installed in accordance with AS 4440. So that sets out various different tolerances for out of plumb and out of line, etc. Typically the rule in all of that is 50 millimeters. Trusses have to be anchored to resist uplift, and because the trusses can only be anchored on the top plates, you need to have sufficient tie down at those top plates. That can be done both by your galv iron strap, but typically it's done by what's called triple grips, which are angles, which are proprietary made fixings that you fix into several faces. So you've got 3 faces in which to fix. Trusses enable very lightweight construction and very rapid construction as well. Super easy for a gable end like this, although one thing I can see straight away that what's been drawn up in here, what they're missing is with our gable truss, like on a pitched gable roof, is slightly lower than your other standard trusses to enable those outriggers to go across at the same plane as our top plate. Also, some of you may remember there was, I don't know, it was at a golf course somewhere, a whole Riverside golf course, a whole roof failed. What's that?
Yeah, Riverside, at West Lakes.
At West Lakes, yeah.
It was basically a square structure.
Yeah, and that was attributed to the style of nail plate that was used. I don't have any nail plates to bring in to show you, but your typical nail plates. So it's just what makes up a nail plate is just a plate of steel that has little fingers punched out of it, and those fingers are pressed into the timber. So you end up having something that is as the name suggests, a combination between plate, steel, and nails. So it's a plate with nails punched through it. Typically, your nails are going to be this sort of shape. So a square shape like that, they're punched out, and those square edges can be pressed into the timber. Somebody had the idea of producing nail plates where your nails are punched out like that, which on the face of it seems like a fantastic idea because they're easily pressed into the timber. The issue with having nails that are that shape is that when you have movement, and that's pushing into our piece of timber here like this, when you get some flexibility and some movement, which is what happens with trussed roofs, those nails work their way out because they're wedge shaped, and they only need to work their way out ever so slightly till there's no longer a sufficient binding to the timber. Whereas a straight cut nail like that is not going to work its way out with any flexing going on, and that caused that failure of those trusses at the Riverside golf course. And as a result of that, so where I used to work, where we'd be inspecting buildings, buildings that have been built and we're repairing various different sections of them, we had to, if we're going up in the roof space, we had to inspect what the nail plates were to see whether they were angled nails or flat nails, which is a very simple thing to see when you see a nail plate, because as your nail plate like that, you can see if the accommodation punched out was straight or whether it was angled just by looking straight onto that nail plate. maybe something you need to know for your future work. May not be. So those sort of nail plates you can't use anymore, but may be a consideration if you are going up into roofs and doing inspections.
Have they actually been engineered? Because you sort of look at it, they only go in about 15 millimetres. So you know, if you get to the point where they're going to get water dripping on them, you know, they're absolutely designed to trap water. And
yeah, but I guess essentially the idea is that you don't have any water dripping on them. Yeah, I personally haven't actually seen any trusses fail from water dripping on them. Strangely enough. Water damage is a massive thing in buildings. I've seen a lot of water damage happening sort of at ground level and sort of heading up from ground level and for floors and things like that. Can't think of any significant water damage I've seen actually within. Not saying that doesn't happen, but certainly the nail plates, all these steel fixings are engineered, and the intellectual property is closely guarded. So it's all, you know, you've got companies like both Prada and Mytech. Anybody producing truss, well, actually no, I was going to say anybody producing trusses in South Australia use either Prada or Mytech. That there might be people using other stuff. I don't know. The two that I know of are Prada and Mytech. So if you go to, you know, like put up, oh no, it wasn't you, it was somebody else, used Port Adelaide trusses recently. You go to Port Adelaide trusses, I can't remember which one they use, I think they're Mytech, and then you go to another truss manufacturer, they'll use Prada. But either way, those companies, they own the intellectual property around the design of those nail plates and the engineering around those nail plates and the various different tie downs, and then they will license that software for truss manufacturers to design roof trusses according to that software using their particular products.
Obviously the nail plates are one.
Yeah.
To me, it doesn't seem anywhere near as strong as some sort of mighty joint and bolt nail scenario.
Oh, it all depends on how that mitre joint is created, and I guess the interaction with the grain of the timber. What a nail plate does is it fixes into the timber, and it's not fixing at one point in a grain. If I've got my piece of timber like this is my big long piece of timber there. If I put a bolt or a fixing through here, and I bolt that and I put a lot of pressure on it, but I only have a surface area like this, it's relying particularly on this piece of or the grain of the timber here not to fail, and it's relying pretty much only on that, because once this bit of grain fails, then this grain fails, and if we only have this sort of surface area of fixing, it's not a really strong fix in comparison to if we fix over that whole piece, because then it's using this grain, this grain, this grain, this grain, this grain, and all of the. So what we're doing is, with the use of a nail plate, we're spreading the fixing point over many, hedging our bets, essentially. That's what it does, but yes, where it's not nearly as strong is that it's using very thin plate steel, and it's not providing the compression that a bolted fixing will provide, and it's not providing the interlocking that a mitered joint also, or a say like a half house joint or a mortise and tenon joint, something like that. It's not, or dovetail joint. It's not providing that interlocking. So yeah, strengths and weaknesses. But what it does, it just makes manufacture really quick and easy. So as you can see on the table here, they set out the bottom chord, top chord, and then have all the webs calculated and cut exactly, put them all in there, and then just press all the nail plates in. It's a very, very quick process of manufacture. The same thing with your steel trusses as well. So your light gauge steel framing, same type of thing. Doesn't use nail plates. They use other plates and other fixings specific to the profile of the steel.
And with the steel you see them, and you basically you've got your tiny little
yes,
and you go,
yeah,
really?
yeah. Look,
I suppose
I guess,
it works, so I'm not questioning.
Exactly, yeah. I haven't seen any foul. In fact, I really haven't seen many truss failures. The couple that I've seen have been in regards to fires happening in roofs and sections burning out. So there's not a not a great it doesn't happen a great deal apart from the very famous example down at Riverside Golf Course. Also, once again, various different forms of trusses. So trusses come in many different forms. And also back to this one, see our light gauge steel framing. One thing that you'll notice about light gauge steel framing, if you drive around some subdivisions where there's plenty of building activity going on, and you have a good close look at frames, they incorporate trusses just about everywhere. So it used to be that your light gauge steel framing looked very similar to your timber framing, where you'd have studs and noggins and things like that. Whereas now you look at the walls of your light gauge steel framing, and it's just a whole series of trusses in walls, trusses as lintels, trusses for your roof, etc. These trusses here, where we've got our bottom plate cantilevering, called cantilever truss. How to say it? As a building designer, you will not design trusses. You'll have an idea of how those. What's that?
That's a good thing.
Yes, yeah. You'll have an idea of what's going to go in there, and as you work more, you have more and more of an idea of what those trusses are going to look like, and what's going to be involved in the trusses. But basically, what you do is you design your roof, and you design keeping those things in mind. Then you send it off to the truss manufacturer. The truss manufacturer looks at your roof, puts the information into their software, their design software, and that will design trusses. And it's very important that is the process which happens, because the interactions between compression and tension within a truss are fairly complex, and it's not the sort of thing that you should go muck around with designing, unless you're going to over engineer significantly. But with these cantilever trusses, what we've got happening here, we've got a piece of timber, a timber web going straight up from that to help support our top chord in compression at that point, and transfer loads directly to our studs beneath. So I've mentioned with our trusses, slightly different terminology with a truss than with a pitched roof. We've got top chords. So that's like the rafter in your pitched roof, but they're top chords. You've got these pieces of timber in between, which are called webs, and then your bottom chord, which is like your ceiling joist in a pitched roof. So I mentioned that there's complex interactions between compression and tension in a truss. When, let's say, I put a huge load over this one here, park an elephant on the roof or something there, at that point I'll put this one in compression, which will put a bowing, a deflection on the bottom chord, which will put this one in tension, which will pull on our ridge and place this one in slight compression and the other one in tension, etc. But as we get wind pouring over a roof doing this or that, it's going compression, tension, and there's that continual interaction between all of these members going on. Because we have that continual interaction between all of those members going on, what we don't want to do is go putting a wall under here and fixing that wall to that bottom chord. If we go putting a wall there and fixing that bottom chord, we don't allow that bottom chord to move slightly, it puts everything else out of whack. And then, you know, in that scenario, we might have additional tension put on our ridge here and end up pulling apart our fixing at the top, for example. That's, you know.
So the interior wall, that will go at the bottom stone, where the bottom stone chord is. You know,
Yeah,
you put it right underneath there, wouldn't you?
not necessarily, not all the time. So yeah, and I'll go through how we go installing internal walls under trusses in a minute. Yeah, actually, we'll go through this pretty quickly. Just remember your terminology. So your bottom chord is like your ceiling joist. Top chord is basically your rafter. These are sail-over trusses, so that's where we've got a top chord sailing over the top plate. Our webs, so that's a type B truss, so it's going to be W for the web. So trusses are super simple for gable end roofs. You can also use them for forming up hip ends as well. When you form up a hip end, it just means you have a bunch of odd-looking trusses involved. So our standard truss, that's going to be that standard sort of triangular shape, like this. Triangular shape, bottom chord, web happening in here like this. That's our standard truss. Right where our hip joins onto our ridge is going to be our last standard truss. The reason for that is because we've got the top chords of our hip truss, which sail over these other trusses here, and we have our hip, which is sloping, meaning that the top of those trusses have to be cut off. In truss terms, they're called truncated. So if ever you see a truss which is called a truncated whatever, it means the top has been chopped off, and in replacement of that triangular top is just a flat top plate. Sorry, a top chord. So, and also when we talk about trusses in a gable end, we talk about stations as well. So our last standard truss right there is our first station. Our second station is this first truncated truss, and typically at our third station is what's called a girder truss. Not all girder trusses are truncated. A girder truss is a truss that picks up the weight of other trusses. So your standard trusses, your first truncated truss there, they're taking the weight. Oh, actually no, I'll leave out that one. But your standard trusses there, throughout the rest of your roof, they're just taking the weight that's associated with themselves and halfway between the next truss along. They're not taking the load of any other trusses. Your girder trusses, they are taking the load of the hip trusses, which join onto our girder. They're also taking the weight of the creeper trusses joining onto the girder, and vicariously via our hip trusses, they're taking the weight of these other creeper trusses that go up to our hips. They're taking the weight of the jack trusses and then the creeper trusses. So that girder truss is taking all the weight of that hip section, all those trusses that are mounting onto that. Because of that, our girder truss needs to be designed to be really quite strong, and it's going to use thicker pieces of timber than the rest of our trusses. It is very important for you to understand that diagram. So review that in your notes.
Would any of that be actually constructed on site?
Oh yes, all of that's constructed. So the
standard truss would be factory built.
Oh, no, sorry. No, all the trusses will be built in a factory and sent out to site on truck. But then the whole hip end is all put together on site. So typically you don't see manufactured hip ends going down the freeway. Although I think that's possibly something a little bit more in the future where you do have whole sections of manufactured roof heading off. But for all intents and purposes, for now, all these trusses, well, the trusses are made in a factory, and then that hip end gets assembled on site.
So if I'm looking at that there, and I'm looking at the drawing of the trusses, the creeper truss,
Yeah.
you could use that on a skilly roof.
Yes. Yeah. Exactly. And that's another thing. This is the terminology specifically for this hip end, but you use different terminology for basically the same trusses in different scenarios as well. And you can, knowing these truss shapes, you can design just about any roof using trusses. So a combination of trusses to do all sorts of things on a roof. We flick through that bit just quickly. See if I can find. Got some interesting roofs. Yeah, maybe that's a little bit too But within this roof, we've got a whole interaction of a whole bunch of all these different shaped trusses doing their thing, forming major hips, minor hips, etc. Yeah, we'll get to that. Maybe I was jumping too quickly forward to try to explain that one. So just a brief history on trusses. You go to like an old wool store or something like that, you might see some just massive big Oregon trusses, this sort of shape. So king post truss, where you've just got one post in the center, and then really thick, like 5mm steel plates bolted through at your apex joints, etc. Then queen post trusses, where you have your central post and then webs coming out from that. This type of, and these are just general, of course, because you can have your massive big Oregon trusses that will span large distances with this simpler design, but in standard residential construction spans up to 5 meters, queen post up to 6. Type A truss, I called a truss earlier on, type B that had a W for words, type A. With the W for web, spans up to 9 meters. Type B, multiple webs spanning up to 14 meters, and these are all just your standard trusses. So we don't have any truncation. We're not triangular. We're not saddle trusses, etc. So that's your truncated truss. So it's cut off at the top, and then your truncated girded truss. Once again, cut off at the top, but much heavier construction. Cantilever truss, where your bottom chord is cantilevered out. Typically, your last web in a cantilever truss is going to go straight up. Cut off truss, so that's where you've got a point of support here, and then that portion is cut off. You would use that in a scenario like where you've got an adjoining wall for a property. You've got a roof with a pitch in behind a parapet wall, and then you've got your parapet wall on this side, and you've got your parapet gutter in behind that. A half truss, so like for a skillion roof, for example.
What sort of pitch are all these examples based on?
They look like, they look
28?
Yeah, it's around the 30 degrees or so.
So 45 degrees would give you a much stronger roof, wouldn't it?
Don't know about the interactions. Those. Yeah. Do you? Yeah. Is case specific? Yeah. Some things don't fit in a nutshell. Yeah. So we've been through that, our traditional framing, etc. So trusses enable much lighter members to be used. Trusses, or some trusses, not all, are designed with a slight camber. So when they're manufactured with a slight camber in them, if they're going to be taking significant loads, so that under load it settles to being directly straight. Deflection isn't an issue in and of itself, structurally, but visually any form of deflection is an issue. We like to see lovely straight lines, etc. in buildings. Therefore, if we're going to have significant loads placed on some members, they're designed to have a positive camber that settles once the designed loads are applied.
So that'd be more for like tile roofs as opposed to...
Exactly, yeah. So for a tile roof where you've got 90 kilograms per square metre, that's more of a consideration than...
If you're looking future and you're sort of saying, okay, we're now getting to putting more and more solar on roofs, are the roof, and solar does weigh significantly.
Yeah.
The standard roof supposedly will take it, but shouldn't we be designing the roof or the roof trusses to accommodate that additional load? Because now you're seeing 4 or 5 kilowatts of weight.
Yeah.
Solar panels on the roof. We may have let a tin roof. That wasn't designed.
Yeah, that's an area which sort of I think gets conveniently overlooked a lot. I know that's probably not the PC way of approaching that. That's very much a question for a truss manufacturer, but I can tell you that I was going to send off some information to a truss manufacturer recently. They didn't ask me whether I'll be putting solar on the roof for that design. I know, but it's up to them as the truss manufacturer, I guess, to there's not solar going on that roof, so it's not a consideration, not something I'd bring up and say, look, we're going to be doing that.
It's often a retrofit scenario. And you got me thinking about the trusses.
Yeah, once again.
And the weight factor on that, and that's a lot lighter than the standard.
Yes, than your standard solar panels in their frames.
5 kilos per
length. Yeah. So what is important? Yeah, what is important for roof design, particularly when it comes to things like solar panels, is weight per square metre, because your solar panel weights are distributed fairly evenly. Well, actually, the load is actually distributed through 2 aluminium channels. So you've got your solar panels like this, next one here like this, etc., etc. Typically, the way they're mounted is underneath. You got 2 aluminium channels that run like this, and then those aluminium channels, so they're channeled like that. You've got these fixings that go into your solar panels, and then they sit on these feet, which are then fixed into your purlins that sit underneath it. Your sheeting. And so those loads should be transferred directly into your purlins or your battens, and that is a fairly regular loading, on your roof, because those channels, they're fixed along intermediately. They are fairly rigid in and of themselves, and they transfer that load directly to your roof framing. And I think it's around 15 kilos per square metre or so these solar panels weigh. Certainly, if the roof has been designed to that hair's breadth of 10 kilograms per square metre for your sheet roofing, and then you add another 15 kilos per square metre for solar panels, that's doubling what that roof was designed for. Possibly truss manufacturers as a standard course, and this I don't know, right? Possibly they're designing. Yeah, yeah. So that really is trust. Yeah, yeah. But I imagine the answer you're going to get is it's all case specific. What people are doing, they might be doing something in their own practice today at this point in time. What people were doing 15, 20 years ago, it's probably going to be significantly different.
Yeah, see, what's got me, I always had the idea of designing and building my own garage.
Yep.
And then when I look at all the actual drawings and the calculations that engineering specs that have to go through, the garage I would have built would have been like a structural steel solid, Sydney Harbour Bridge thing compared to what you'd buy over the counter.
Yeah.
So how do these guys get away with such light?
Because what they've done is they've engineered all those connections, all those pieces of steel to resist events which will happen in a 1 in 100 year event. So it's like, okay, these are the likely forces that structure is going to encounter, and they'll design things to, just exceed that. Yeah. And that's I guess that is the quirk of of our building codes and engineering and approvals, in that you can get people who will design things which they'll stand up in a storm, but unless you've got that piece of paper, unless you've got the calculations to back it up, unless you've got the justification through the National Construction Code, it won't stand up in court. And that's the crux.
Yeah, because what I heard, there was once, in the old days, they had a safety factor built in to where the material would yield at about 5 times the safety limit, and now that's dropping down and down.
Yeah, because companies compete with each other. Because someone will go to Shed King and they go, oh yeah, we can do that shed for 7. Stratco can do it for 6.5. Looks the same. All right, go. And sorry, I'm just pulling names out of the air. I'm not saying that Stratco is cheaper than Shed King or whatever, right? But what's that?
That's how I do the shed for Shed King.
Yeah,
but it's actually, I think it's better quality.
Yeah, but people make those decisions. People shop around. They go, especially because there's with the internet, so quick and easy to go. Okay, who are the shed manufacturers around here? Who can I get a shed from? And they can look at a whole bunch and they can go, all right, who's going to give me the best price on this?
Are there any laws covering houses where you have to have a certain safety factor of 3 built in, or?
I don't know. That all goes into the design of the Australian standards and all the manufacturing tolerances. So there is, I know New South Wales government put out a fact sheet on design tolerances. That's more around spacings and so on of things, and how much you should allow for deflection and all this type of thing. But no, in terms of all your material properties, etc., I don't know. I don't know what these manufacturers have up their sleeves in regards to tolerances. So like certainly, your major steel manufacturers like One Steel, they'll say this particular I-beam, this particular section, it has this, these properties, these sectional properties, this yield strength, etc. And they'll give that information. And whether they manufacture that to a higher standard by 10%, 15%, 20%, I don't know. Right, internal walls. Internal walls in a trussed roof. Unfortunately, there's no diagrams for that. And with our internal walls, because we want that bottom chord to be able to deflect slightly, when we fix, so we'll have, and I'll draw this internal wall really large, and I'll create a space under that. So obviously our internal wall isn't going to be that large underneath our truss. But with our internal wall, we'll have on top of that a bracket which is shaped like this, and will fix in. And so that bracket is going to fix in to our bottom chord of our truss like that, and then fix in to the top plate of that internal wall. On the side, that bracket is going to look like this. So if we're looking at, or in elevation, we look at it front on, we've got elongated nail holes. Like that. The reason we have elongated nail holes, then we put a nail in here, we won't shoot that nail in really hard. That'll have to be hammered in and have just that potential for a little bit of movement. So our bottom chord can move up and down like that. So that's where, and this is where we've got our internal wall. And I should have some space there. Well, actually what I should do is I'll draw that bottom chord up there like that. So we've got some space here like this. So we've got to have a little bit of space in there. That's where we've got our top plates perpendicular to our bottom chords. Our bottom chords going this way, our top plate of our internal wall going perpendicular to it. When we're running our internal walls parallel, we'll still need to have some fixing of that top plate. So because we don't want walls on the inside just falling over, the way that we do that is if we look at this is our roof here with our trusses going across like that, and we're doing an internal wall through here, we'll trim this out with what's called trimmers. So pieces of timber the same size as those bottom chords, fixed into the bottom chords, and then we fix our internal wall to that. Once again, these brackets to allow all these trimmers to move up and down with the bottom chords, because our ceiling will be attached to those trimmers.
Just goes into a slot or in the top.
No, so that bracket is just nailed into the top.
So yeah, which is
Yeah.
nailed in.
Now, it's an L-shaped bracket, nailed in firmly at the top, nailed in fairly firmly at this point in time. At that section there, so it can move up and down a little bit, but it stops the wall from doing any of this, like falling over or moving any which way. And that trimming here, that's also important if we are going to be mounting our ceiling lining directly off the bottom chord of our trusses, then we need to be trimming out there. I think I mentioned it last week that with our steel sheet roof framing, we have our trusses at 1200 centres. With our tile roofing, we have our trusses at 600 centres. When we go to fix our ceiling linings, which have to be fixed at 600 centres for a sheet roof, that's a problem. Well, it's not a problem, right? It's an issue that's been solved a long time ago. For doing that, there are two ways to do it. One is to run intermediate joists, so joists between all of our bottom chords, and then a hanging beam through mounted on our bottom chords that pick up our intermediate joists. Those trusses need to be designed for doing that. Or the other way, which is slightly more timber to be used, is to have batten out your bottom chords and then fix at 600 centres. So another batten here, like that, etc., etc., etc. Fix your ceiling lining to that. That's typically what's happening now, though, because it's really quick and easy. And you use not exactly that profile, but something similar to that. This top hat section, super light, super cheap, nailed to the bottom side of your bottom chords, and that becomes your ceiling lining fixing.
So all the interior walls don't actually go up to the actual truss. So why do we have load-bearing walls in some houses?
So load-bearing. With our standard roof frames previously, where I said we've got underpurlins and struts happening. So we've got some significant struts happening for our underpurlins there. That load has to be transferred somewhere. And so with your conventionally pitched roof, you do have to have load-bearing walls. So you have load-bearing walls spaced, or you space your struts and your end of your hanging beams, all that sort of stuff. All of your point loads get placed onto where you have internal load-bearing walls. With a trussed roof, you do not have load-bearing walls inside there. As a general statement, so you can have roofs which are a combination of things, but yeah. as a general rule, trusses, you won't have any load-bearing walls inside. And so that's our fixing to our top plate, the slotted nail holes, and this is our triple grip here for our wall junction there. So it provides some separation of the bottom chord to the wall. Your truss design is going to be contingent upon several things: the type of roof covering. So here I've got a whole series of, I've got a bunch of different sheet roof coverings, and we'll have a look at those later. It's going to be contingent upon the pitch of your roof, so how steep the top chord is. Also contingent upon the wind category. That wind category is going to define how strong the trusses need to be, and what the tie downs need to be, the actual spans of course, and the ceiling lining. That will dictate the loads that are placed on your bottom chord. When ordering trusses, the following information must be provided: house plan, correct spans, special loads, maybe solar panels, and special conditions. Also, truss manufacturers are going to now ask for bushfire attack level as well, particularly if it's going to be a sailover truss. They want to know bushfire attack level. They'll want to know wind speed, roof design plan, pitch, span. What else are they going to want to know? That's pretty much it. But they would want to have a copy of your floor plan. So they start with your floor plan and also your roof design, and they'll design the trusses to suit. So we've been through some very simple uses of trusses, but trusses can be used in a whole multitude of ways to create a whole multitude of different roof shapes and designs. The only truss that we haven't covered yet, or the only common truss we haven't covered yet, is what's called a saddle truss. A saddle truss is a truss which sits on top of other trusses. We would use a saddle truss where we have got, particularly in this scenario here, we've got a hip end here, and we've got a ridge coming through onto a much larger hip end there, like that. So these are going to be standard trusses coming through here, but then we're going to need some support for that roof sheeting as it makes its way onto this hip here. So what we have there are tiny little triangular trusses. So we've got our standard trusses like that. Our saddle trusses are going to be smaller, and the next one along the smaller ones still until this that one there is going to be much smaller trusses. So those saddle trusses, they mount directly on top of these other trusses. So those jack trusses in our hip end, those saddle trusses are going to mount on top of those. Just provide support for your purlins underneath your sheeting. Nothing else too complex. I know it looks complex, but it's just simply an interaction of all these different type of hip ends, really. If you understand a hip end and the way you form up a hip end with your various different types of trusses, and then you know about saddle trusses, then that whole thing, if you sit down and work through it, makes sense. So it's just a various interaction of a bunch of jack trusses, hip end truss, girder truss, first truncated truss, standard truss, creeper trusses here. And there we go. There's another sort of roof design of trusses using pretty standard trusses, except we've got a form of cut-off truss here, which is a cut-off truncated girder truss. So it's an interesting one. And yes, another cut-off girder truss here, which is not your standard. So a lot of your less complex roofs, so where we've got a major hip and a minor hip interacting and just a simple L-shaped floor plan, going to be set out like that. You have these abbreviations which tell you what type of truss it is and what number of truss. Basically, like it's like a slightly more complex diagram of an IKEA wardrobe. Also, you've got all your bits named and numbered, so you can understand where they go. Can anybody tell me what, say, J7 stands for?
Joist.
No, not joist.
Jack.
Jack. Yeah. All right. So we've got jack truss. We've got C10. This one here. Nick, tell me what C10. What starts with C that might be truss thing? I'll let you take that one. Yeah, so it's a creeper truss. Yeah, so that's creeper truss number 10. H3, Dylan. What do you reckon that H3 would stand for? Sorry. Yeah, sorry. Nobody's eyes glaze over. I'll pick you out. Can anybody tell me what H3 stands for?
That's the hazard.
No.
We went through that.
Okay. Anybody apart from Eric, and apart from any wisecracks, can tell me what that H3 might stand for?
That's for hip 3?
Yeah, hip truss. So it's our hip, and that's hip number 3. So we've got our hip 1s up here, our hip 2s here, and our hip 3 happening there. Notice here we've got hip 1 here, exactly the same as our hip 1 there. So different ends of the building, but they're going to be exactly the same trusses. Yep. So they're going to be exactly the same size and shape, hence it's hip 1. All right, slightly more complex one, TG2. Anybody have any idea what?
Sorry, which one?
Yeah, truncated. Oh, sorry, TG2. That's truncated girder, and TS1 just below that. Carly?
Truncated standard.
Yeah, truncated standard. Yeah, and yeah. Okay, last one's our T1s here. Taylor?
Is it truncated?
Well, yeah, except those ones are not truncated. So they're heading straight up to a ridge. Nothing's chopped off. Yep, truss 1, truss 2, truss 3. Oh, actually, what I haven't, no, there's one other truss in here which I haven't mentioned yet. We've got S1, S2, S3, S4. Somebody who hasn't answered a question yet. What's that S's stand for? So, yeah, standard. Yeah. So there are standard. Sorry, no, not our standards. There are saddle trusses. Sorry. So saddle trusses. They're the ones that are sitting on top of the other ones, and sometimes you get trusses called ST1, like, but that's not a good idea because like ST1 can mean standard truss number 1, or it can mean saddle truss number 1. Those names both start with S. So in this diagram, that's why these ones are known as T. Just your standard trusses are T1s, etc. And then your saddle trusses are denoted by an S.
So the different numbers shows different sizes.
No, different well, in that example for our saddle trusses, yes, it shows the different sizes. But basically, the way it should be seen is that those different numbers just simply denote a different truss. So, in terms of our H1, they're all going to be exactly the same. So that's like piece, H1. So I go, yeah, okay, I need an H1, you can grab me an H1, right? Whereas when we come to form up these hip ends, they're a different truss, different size, yes. So we use an H3 for those ones. This is our set of instructions that says where each particular piece will go. Yeah.
What they use the program? What kind of program do they use to
I don't know. I don't know. Yeah.
Because this one looks like some program.
Right.
So I just wonder.
Yeah. So you're different. So I mentioned before Prida and Mitech. Prida and Mitech produce their own programs for designing trusses, and people who produce trusses using either of those products use that design software for designing those trusses. And so yeah, you've got your
It sort of makes a bit of a mockery about having a BIM program like one or Rivet or CAD because you then rely, like it's got a situation in those, which we haven't played with, sort of not doing it, but you sort of go, well, hang on, there's a program that's got the facility and you're going off and using someone else to do it.
yes. So it makes a bit of a mockery of it at the moment, but that's the way that we are heading with that BIM software. Is that it does become very interactive, and the whole idea is that you have these, well, in the future you have these various different patches that will design certain elements, so you don't have to be sending stuff off to people that like look, I don't know how far in the future, or actually, essentially, I guess, it's just sort of future gazing. Can't say it's going to happen for sure, but you'll have engineering firms like Mitech or Prada or something that will go, all right, we've got this patch for Revit. Do the thing. It produces your trusses manufactured by this particular manufacturer uses Prada products. There you go. I imagine that's the way things are going to go. Yeah, yeah.
As you're doing a design, that's what I mean. I'm sort of looking at and going, well, hang on, we design a house. You'd hope it would just be happening in the background.
Yes.
And doing it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I imagine that's not too far off, because what you have, and in the time since I studied, when I study, I guess it's getting on 10 years ago now.
What did you study?
Diploma of building design.
Oh.
Yeah. Well, I've studied a bunch of things, but that's one of the things I did. When I was doing it, there were so many calculations you had to do yourself, like for calculating box gutters, calculating all these timber, doing all these calculations. Like I said, essentially we still teach all those calculations here at TAFE because they're relevant to actually, what goes into that design. But so much of that calculation, so much of that grunt work, it's all being done by programs now. If I want to size up a box gutter, I go box gutter calculator, type it into Google, and I've got a box gutter calculator that will calculate me a box gutter for the Australian standards.
Would it calculate the flashings required for that job?
No.
Because that's got to be
No.
the most difficult job looking at it.
Yeah. No, not really. No. So we've got a valley gutter happening in here. So we'll have some valley boards on that, and we'll have that sitting in the valley. Apart from that, it's all fairly simple, flashing wise. But no, flashings. That all the case specific stuff, all the stuff that's a little bit out of the ordinary. Yeah, that's where designers are still having to be essentially involved a little bit more.
It's going to be an AI thing that will just be part of the program.
Yes, yeah, and I have heard that Mitech are developing their own program that I can't. Yeah, sorry, I can't remember what I.
One of the program name is Space.
Space.
Yeah, I hear that, but
right.
I don't know how to use it. But usually, the engineer bring the CAD file first, and then they doing the boundary, and then put the loading and the wind effect.
Yes.
And then the program to figure out everything, and then they found that like engine part, so which one is weak, and then they put the bracing, and then figure out.
Yes, how to make that section stronger, so they find the weakest link, and then
Yeah, but I don't know in Australia what kind of program they use.
Unfortunately, I don't know either. Yeah. Yeah, but yeah, what I do know from chatting with engineers that design slabs, for example, there are programs for designing concrete slabs. So you just give them the stuff, they punch the numbers in, they go, that's the size beams and that's the size reinforcing you need. And I was able to get an answer like that, you know, just really quickly on that. It's, you know, yeah, because it is all just simply tables and calculations and things like that. Yes, why not? Why can't we have programs that do that? And then why can't we have that interactive, or all of those calculations interacting with our drawing software? It's just a matter of time before people create those patches and those mechanisms to go in, and that's what BIM is.
Yeah, because that's what sort of got me 40 years ago. You could be in the trade for 10, 15 years and not much has changed. Now, you know, 15 months later,
Yeah.
things come out and you've got to work with new stuff that you've never seen before.
Yeah, and somebody comes up with an idea and a way of doing something which makes the construction process 10% cheaper. Boom.
Yeah.
You know, yeah. That's what we're dealing with. And also, you know, essentially, yes, all this is important information because when we work with buildings, not all of us are going to be working and designing brand new buildings and brand new constructions or standalone construction. So many of you will be working with additions and alterations, and it's important, or even repair and reinstatement work. It's important for you to understand all the old stuff as well as understand all the new stuff that's coming in. How can we get that to interact? How can we look into things also in terms of being case specific and not simply generated? And so that's where the whole, you know, something like this, the whole research component is incredibly important for you guys, and to be on top of all the new stuff that's coming through. So quickly from our framing, we'll finish off with the roof cladding today. So our claddings of our roofs are very important in terms of the design aesthetic. It's one of those things that really stands out in buildings and can help differentiate a building, and it will. And I guess our roofs are not designed independently of the rest of the aesthetic of the building as well. So we think about those roofs, and so often the possibilities of the roof are going to be dictated by the materials that are used to produce that roof, either with the framing or the cladding. So pitch, flat, curved, etc. You know, are we going to be carrying 90 kilograms per square meter, or, you know, something like, you know, 15, 20 kilograms a square meter for, you know, asphalt tiles on a on plywood? So there are a whole bunch of different profiles for roof sheeting. So I've got a few profiles. In fact, might as well start off. We'll jump up here, have a look at these different profiles of roof sheeting, look at the various different things we've got here. As well as what I've got on the table, there's a bunch of other things as well. And this is only a small sample of what's out there as well. So many things, so many differences. I've got these two sitting together for a reason. A lot of people talk about corrugated iron roofs. So that's what we call custom orb sheeting. Well, this bottom one here is what's called custom orb sheeting. This top one here is the product name is Blue Orb, but for anybody looking, and I'll pass those two around together, have a look at them like that. You'll see that one is a slightly different profile than the other. And to the trained eye from driving along on the street, you see how we've got one piece which is fairly flat and then tight curve, fairly flat, tight curve, fairly flat, tight curve. The other one is very round very round like this. This round one, that's your old form of rolling, where your radius is carried through, and then you have a very small flat section, and it's just like large radius like this. This one you have a much larger flat section and a fairly tight radius on it. For some people can't spot the difference. Other people who have been working in roofing and so on can spot it straight away. And also, or intuitively, people see a difference as well. It's important to match all your heritage stuff with this same. Well, it's important to be aware of that. I guess it's up to your client whether they spend that extra little bit to match it or not.
Come off a heritage roof.
Yeah. So that's yeah. I didn't use this one for the example because it's a bit beaten up and it's sort of not quite as shaped. But you can see that it's originally it was fairly round eye on that. I did grab this one though, also for those heritage considerations. This is covered in galvanizing. This is galvanized. This one is zinc-aluminum. When they're new, they look kind of similar to me. I think that the difference stands out like the proverbial. But once they age differently. Your zinc-aluminum your galv greys off, and your zinc-aluminum doesn't grey off to nearly the same extent. Also, with your zinc-aluminum, I don't have any bits here that have been rubbing against a tree, but when you get trees and branches and things rubbing against zinc-aluminum, you get these black bits on there. I think it looks really unsightly. You don't get that to nearly the same extent with your galv.
And you can solder that, the old stuff.
Right, because the galv will bond to solder, whereas this one, the zinc-aluminum won't bond to solder.
Zinc-aluminum, it's all so-elastic. Nothing will take to it except for so-elastic.
Right.
And even some of that doesn't work.
Yeah.
We found out that the real hard way when we did a warehouse at Apple Park.
Right.
And Boston did the bad batch, but they were prepared to replace it.
Yeah.
Like we had to replace the whole roof. So
right.
The cost of the sealant.
Yeah.
Was nothing.
Yeah. So your tube of sealant don't cost that much. In comparison to replacing the whole roof.
Right.
But major, so I wasn't aware of that. There's that different bonding capabilities with that, so that's important to consider. But also the reason we have galv and we don't just have straight iron. So this is made of mild steel. So steel which can rust. So once the galvanizing is worn away, it will rust. That's why we don't make it simply out of mild steel. The galvanizing is, does anybody know the contents of galv?
Well, galv's zinc.
Yeah.
And
tin
and
tin.
Zinc. They're big copper in.
But basically, the galv coating is more reactive than the steel. And because it's more reactive, like it oxidizes quicker and easier, it works as what's called a sacrificial anode. So the galv will rust and take the free electrons from your steel in that process to stop the steel actually bonding with oxygen. So we've got our free electrons. They want to bond with oxygen. When you've got that happening, that's what corrosion is. So our rust on the bottom of that is steel, or that's iron bonding with oxygen.
You look at that, that's close to 100 years old.
Yeah.
It's done its job.
Yeah, might have done its job in the storeroom. No, your galv certainly lasts. So this is slowly corroding, and that's why it greys off like this as well, because it is bonding with oxygen. It is slowly rusting away. That sacrificial anode, which is attached to our steel, is slowly becoming depleted. Now, it will take a very long time to become depleted before it's fully depleted, and then things start to rust because there's nothing to take those free electrons anymore. with your zinc alloy, it's different. Now, with aluminium, aluminium is also a highly reactive metal. So aluminium oxidizes really well, but for anybody it is expensive, yeah. But with your you mentioned before you worked for Land Rover or so, yeah. So your Land Rovers, well, your early ones made of aluminium.
So was the Rolls Royce that we played with just we got a 1935 Rolls Royce.
Yeah.
This week shipped down from Sydney, and it's all aluminium.
Yeah.
Except for a couple of things in the door frames, wooden aluminium.
Yeah. And that aluminium, you think, oh, that's okay, shocking material for a car because it dents easy, all that sort of stuff. But the thing is, and it's highly reactive. But the thing with aluminium is when it oxidizes, it forms a protective coating on the outside, which stops any further oxidation happening. So it forms a protective layer as it oxidizes, meaning that the whole car isn't going to corrode. This with zinc alum, that stands for zinc aluminium. So that's zinc aluminium alloy. Because we've got that aluminium in there, it will take the free electrons from the steel for a little bit, but then it will form a protective coating on it itself. And so that sacrificial anode will end up protecting itself, unlike the galv, which is just a linear thing of time and exposure. This one will form a protective coating on itself.
Yeah, it still has issues.
It still has issues, yeah.
You don't leave ribbon nails or steel swarf on it.
No. Yeah. So swarf is the big thing. Swarf is just little bits of metal left over from when you get tech screws. Tech screws are screws that cut their own hole. So you drive them in with a tech driver. If you've got steel purlins underneath, you'll be using tech screws that will cut through that and then cut through the steel purlin, and they'll bring up little bits of swarf, hot, and it's really hot metal, and it rusts really quickly. It will rust in a couple of days. If you don't blow the swarf off a roof, you start getting all these rusty spots from these little bits of really hot metal that rust very quickly. Those little bits of those little bits of swarf, where they rust, that will make points of rust on your roof as well. So for anybody doing roofs or whatever, you have to blow them off thoroughly when you're finished, particularly if you're fixing into steel purlins. It's more of an issue with steel purlins than it is tinted purlins.
And don't rely on the rain to wash them away to the gutters.
No, don't rely on the rain to wash the swarf away to the gutters. No. Also, very, very, very strange thing, because I've built a lot of really large scale water tanks, and so I've been inside these water tanks after they've been certain age, whatever, and peeled liners back from wall faces. Also notice where you get bugs squashed against zinc alum, it causes them to corrode as well. What's that?
Body acids.
Yeah, bugs, spiders, and whatever. Yeah, they've got
like
acids.
Car radiator, aluminium car radiator. That's the common reason why most radiators fail.
Yeah.
Other than the fact that there's gunk in them.
Yeah, is that?
Soft corrosion is, but it's bugs, air conditioner condensers, those sort of things.
Yeah.
And even Darwin, for instance, alloy air conditioning condensers, because the bugs up there and the heat.
Yeah.
Just 3 years, usually their life expectancy.
Yeah. And so that's like the Achilles heel to this sort of stuff. Those points, when you get points of corrosion like that, because you don't quite have, this sacrificial anode coating is essentially connected to the whole thing, and it's just going to keep taking electrons for a much longer period. It's thicker. There's more of a sacrificial anode than what's on here. This relies on the protective coating that's created, but if you breach that protective coating by your squashed bugs or by the hot swarf, well then opens it up. Also, so you've got many different profiles happening. So that's our corrugated sheeting, our custom orb and our blue orb, and so you've got various different manufacturers. So you've got Fielders, Stratco, Lysart, Stramit, Revolution. Any other sheeting manufacturers I've forgotten in that mix? What's that? They're the common ones. Yeah. They've got their own names for all their products. A lot of their products are very much the same. So when I talk about products, I'm talking about roof profiles. A lot of these profiles we've got from Revolution, they do some more profiles that some others don't do. So they'll do this one here like this, which is like custom orb, or it's like, well, no, it's a bit more like your traditional, but it's much larger. And I think they have a, yeah, and then they got this dude as well.
They say they can take the weight of a shoe load.
A Mark Prosciutto holding a big fish and an advertiser. Yeah, that roof sheeting, that's been used on, there's a church just near the South Road where it crosses over Crossroads. So you've got Crossroad going under, and you're heading that way on your left-hand side. There's a big church there with solar panels doing a cross. They use that roof sheeting on that place. Yeah, from distance, I guess essentially it looks sort of like custom orb, but just in a grander scale. And then I don't have any mini orb. This is getting close to mini orb. People seen mini orb before?
Yeah,
so,
shop counters. Jeez.
People
get carried away.
Yeah. Though one really good use of mini orb I've seen was in a cafe, where what it does is sort of, to me that says coffee cup. So you can what's that? Yeah. So there's various different sort of links to
its original use in ceilings?
in our place we've got it in the ceiling.
Yeah. In what was my mother's father-in-law's house next door, which is the 1930s house. They must have had an addition sometime in the early 1900s, and they used like a mini orb. And it was a mini orb. As well, and it's still in the house today.
Yeah, apparently, sort of, acoustic-wise, it's a sound deadener. I don't know how it works, but it's
I guess why they use it. It'd be how that sound is refracted from. So you get sound reflected from an uneven surface. Same, like inside a recording studio or so, you have sections of just really articulated wall. The idea is just confuse the reflection of the sound. So the sound still gets reflected, but it gets reflected off in all different directions, whatever. I guess that does that as well. So you've got mini orb. That's fairly, once again, a modern take on a traditional rolling of steel. Can't remember what that one is called. And then this one, it's called Greco. It's also what's it called? Spandeck. It's sort of a, how do I say it? Late 70s, early 80s kind of aesthetic.
It's ended up becoming a fencing material.
Yes, you see it a lot. Yes, you use a lot for fences. That's right. Yeah. So there's that profile. You get a greater span out of this than you do out of that. So your purlin spacing can be much larger. I don't know my purlin spacings off the top of my head, and there are lots of different thicknesses and so on. We've got 0.42, 0.48, 0.6 base metal thickness of this stuff. That will dictate how far your purlin spacings are. But just for sake of comparison, this one you get about 1200 mil span for your internal spans. This one's like 15 or 1700 mil span. So different spanning capabilities. Unfortunately, I don't have any. Well, we've got this one here, which is also a metal decking. This is like clip lock. This one, you don't have any fixings through it. You've got fixings that are underneath. Now, this is the wrong fixing for this one. You see, spacing's incorrect. But that's how they're fixed down. You fix these to your purlins first, and this gets popped on. And then this sheet here essentially pops onto that one there like that. So that one will clip onto here, or the next sheet along.
Some of the one I'm getting is from Revolution.
It's
Hisense, and that virtually is about 10 mil straight up and down.
Yeah.
And where that comes down,
okay,
it then is screwed into your purlins, and as that clips over the other side, it covers it.
Yes, covers those screw fixings.
That's what. So you can't. You got your three 370
Yeah.
as your pan.
Yeah.
You can't go wider than 370, otherwise your deflection means you'll have big bows in it. So then you've got, like I've got to, you've got to put plywood underneath it.
Yeah, which is an
to
expensive
stop.
process. Yeah.
It is.
That's what made it
Yeah.
so expensive, was it installing all the clips.
Yeah.
You know, I still remember the day the Ramset came out with the explosive charges and
Yeah.
geez, yeah, the amount of nails that were flying around building sites, I tell you, it was a dangerous place to be. But you know, once that came in, and you know, clip lock just took over because it was just so quick to put up.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, because we were shooting nails through you know, 5 and 6 millimeter steel trusses.
Mm-hmm.
You know, no worries.
Yeah, and there's no way you could have done that previously.
Yeah, crazy stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, and so what was the Revolution one you were talking about? Is that Hisense? Hisense? Yeah. Yeah. So you got and unfortunately I don't have any of those sort of profiles here. We've got some of that sheeting stuff around the tape here as well, called standing seam. Standing seam is, you know, the general name for any of these really flat pan stuff. So this is not what I would call standing seam. Yes, it does have a standing seam, but a lot of and you'll see it on the mining engineering building actually across. So the mining engineering, or the drill core library over there, it's got all the Corten steel on the front of it. Further back on that building, they've got a whole heap of standing seam. And what Doug was talking about with the issues with the pan and maximum widths and so on, where it all gets wonky like this, is called oil canning. So now on that, and it's generally considered to be detrimentally aesthetically, like you want to avoid oil canning. It's actually happened on that building over there, but I think it looks kind of cool. It gives a nice, once again, a nice sort of articulation to that facade. But yeah, have a look at that on your way out. Also, there's some much smaller standing seam cladding as you go through the sliding doors at the end of here, and you look up, you'll see it there as well. But you've got it in various different widths, etc.
Builders go out to 685 in their pan.
685 mil.
It's huge.
Yeah, but you've got to have plywood underneath that, I imagine.
That one you've got to have plywood underneath.
Yeah.
So when I was doing my research, I went, okay, what have you got? I said, oh, we've got flesh, and I've got a piece of it at home. I'll see if I can find it, bring it in on Monday for bringing collection. It's only a little sample.
Yeah.
And then I ended up with Revolution, because they said, oh, we'll do your custom roll.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
At 410. So.
Yeah. Yeah. Cool.
So what about, you know, having all these different all profiles? Obviously, if you want a curved roof, you're going to have to find someone that's got the tooling to do it.
Yes. So your sheeting will curve on site to a certain radius, and you can I don't have that there. So so each of the sheeting manufacturers will put out design manuals that talk about the properties of all their different profiles. And those profiles will differ between the base metal thickness as well. So your 0.42 will do stuff that your 0.48 won't do. But yes, you can curve some of them to an extent on site. Other ones you have to get rolled into a curve, like you're doing a bullnose veranda or something. You use like the modern version of this one. Basically, the steel has a lower yield strength. Like if you go bending this stuff, you have a go actually. You'll find that you grab that. Oh, you've probably done plenty of that previously, anyhow.
Yeah, that's nice and soft.
Yeah, exactly. Pass it around and have a bit of go, right? And then
You won't be on that.
yeah, and then compare it to that.
Oh my god.
Yeah, much different yield strength than the steel. So that stuff you can bend to a fairly tight radius, and you can make bullnose verandas and things like that out of it.
But see, that won't be awkward, because if you try to curve it on site, it's not going to let you know until you lay your traces.
Yeah, that is also an issue. So with all the tank roofs I've done, I curve all the roof sheets with those, and it's all done on site. But it's the process of fixing. So and you've got to stretch your internal flutes and compress your external ones. So you
start at the ends and.
No, you get a sheet put up, and you do and lap your sheets. Then you put your first screw in. Then you go to the outside, do the outside corner, and then you work your way in. And your last flute on your internal one, put the tech screw in on an angle, and then pull it over. So you stretch and you're pressing it there. But So all your different profiles. Also, another thing is this this sort of stuff. Your shallowest pitch is going to be 5 degrees. You can't use that on 3 degrees or 2 degrees. It has to be 5 degrees minimum. With this stuff, this one you can get it down to 2 degrees. Also with your other higher rib stuff, you can get it down to 1 degree of pitch. So that's also a significant difference between these different profiles of roofing, and you've got to think about your roof design for that. Beyond that, a few other bits and bobs. So I had a piece of valley gutter in there. Oh yeah, also different types of gutters. So that one's your standard quad gutter. So very normal, standard sort of gutter shape. This one here is called an OG gutter. So that's more of your colonial style Federation type aesthetic. That one's called a flat back. So we've got a curved gutter that has a flat back on it. So it's a fairly modern profile of gutter. Much the same as your half round gutter. So that's the half round, but much easier for fixing. So because with your gutters, you produce a fall on your gutter and you go through and you nail it. And you nail it at various different points to get your fall correct, and then you do your minor adjustment with your gutter brackets that pick it up and pull it out just a little bit.
What are those ugly gutters that they're coming out now with, the houses are built on the boundary with the brick wall, and they actually got the gutter sitting on top of the wall because they can't go over the boundary?
Oh, that'd be a parapet flashing or parapet gutter. Yeah. Yeah. And they're made up sort of situationally specific.
Yeah, they're all shocking.
And then this one, that's like a shear line profile, so 1980s, 1990s type aesthetic for that one. But like all your sheeting, there are so many different variations on your gutters as well. So it's one of those aesthetic things. But yeah, I don't have anything else.
Out of all those profiles, what's the most common sort of custom morph profile that's used on residential? Knowing the actual roof sheeting.
Yeah, by a huge margin, this one. So that's a custom morph. That's that's the one that has flat tide radius, flat tide radius. That's the most common. Also, actually, I'll pull that one out as well. Notice this one here, those ends have been bent as well. That's done for a purpose. That's where the top of your sheeting gets covered by your ridge capping. You want to bend the bottom of your pans up, and you can do that by just with a adjustable spanner, or a pair of pliers, or what were you going to say?
Soft pliers.
Soft pliers.
I've got a line tool that's got a plastic end on them, so I just go bang, 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 bang.
Yeah, the same happens with the clip lock with a much wider tool.
Yes.
They're pretty clever.
Yeah, and so you have to do that at your ends to ensure that any wind getting blown up, or any water getting blown up there by wind doesn't go inside. Unfortunately, I don't have any ridge capping here to show you. That's a piece of flashing for
just 2 inches.
Yeah, okay. The valley gutter. Okay, that's a ridge capping for a very low pitched roof. So yeah, so you get a capping like this that goes on the top. With that, when we've got a ridge capping that does that, that's unscribed. So you've got these gaps in here like this. That's also what happens in the majority of cases. I much prefer when your ridge capping is scribed into your flutes. So it means you've got this wonky cut on here, like that. It sits down nicely in your flutes. I think it makes the roof look much neater. For the picky people go on and go, oh, that scribed ridge capping, that looks lovely, sort of thing. But it also, for building bushfire prone areas, it's also important as well, because you're not allowed to have a gap of more than 3 millimetres anywhere in the building.
I think a few weeks ago there was a house that caught fire, and the house a couple blocks down caught fire from the ambers, because they got up underneath the eaves.
Yeah. Look, there was when you got another scribe.
Yep.
I'm just trying to think. I used to do it a few years ago. Made a product that was nearly like a foam product.
Yep.
That sat underneath the ridge.
Yes. Yeah.
And squashed into the line. I can't remember what it was.
Yeah. And I don't know what it's called. I used it just recently. Yeah. So you buy it from a building products place. It's got a bell rate. I don't know either actually whether you can buy fireproof compressible foams. Yeah. So there's So you've got ones that have that shape to them already. Like it's a piece of foam like that, and it's a light grey colour. And so it's actually custom mold shape. If you're using it on your traditional sheeting, you have to stretch it a little bit to get it to fit in. So you've got those foams which are cut to that shape already, and you've got this other type of foam which is just a flat thing like that. It's all sticky on the bottom, and it's about this thick when you roll it out, but give it 5 minutes and it'll be about that tall. So you unroll it, it sticks to something, and then it puffs up inside. So that's a way of sealing under your sheeting and under your ridge capping.
Yeah, you don't think much about it until the jacaranda tree drops all its leaves.
Yeah.
And then I thought the actual ridge cap looked really nice. I thought they did a really brilliant job. Yeah. But as soon as the wind and the jacaranda tree did.
Started putting stuff in there. Yeah.
Incredible.
Yeah, so important for that.
That's going to be be one of those things I'll be putting in.
Yeah, to stop. Yeah. Stop that happening.
I assume you can just sort of squash it in from what.
You can. Yes. Yeah. Squash it in, and also if you got hex head screws holding down your hip capping, undo them and poke it in. Whatever it can be retrofit, but.
Didn't the ridge cap, wasn't that actually designed as a ventilation thing as well?
Well, you do have vented ridges, yeah. I think, well, personally, like when I see roofs around the place, for me, like an unscribed versus a scribed ridge capping sort of denotes sort of quality build, less, cheaper build. Possibly, I guess it does have ventilation abilities, but then once you've got ventilation like that, then you've also got entry point for embers in a bushfire or
I think I'll risk this application.
Alright, well, better check how much time we've got. Oh, so we run over time. So thanks again for making it along. So next week we'll touch on masonry. I guess that puts us well, it doesn't put us slightly behind. It puts us back to the schedule we were on previously. So for anybody who I made notes on your assignment that should come and see me after lecture. See me today, see me another day. That's fine. Or we can go through various different bits and pieces. But for those who didn't have a fantastic week, have a look at the assignments. Assignment 2 and 3 up there. So there's plenty of information here to get cracking on your research assignment. Also, another really good thing. I haven't mentioned previously, but I'll mention it now. I'll shrink this down. All of you will have access via your TAFE email or your Outlook from TAFE, and let's just get it to take its time to open up. You've got access to this thing here called OneNote as well, which is a very handy tool for organising research as well. It's just this repository that actually, well, I hope.
Is there like Evernote? Is it similar like Evernote?
AbleNote.
Evernote.
Oh, Apple Note.
Yeah.
Possibly it is.
A similar
Probably,
one?
yeah. I imagine it probably would be very similar. Yeah. So I'll just quickly. So this is a OneNote that another student has done and shared. So they've used it for being a repository predominantly for URLs. So they'll go, oh, yeah, roof structural, wall structural, floor structural, and they put a lot of URLs in there. You can also just put images in there. You can put all sorts of stuff in there. It's a really good way of organising research. So you can have a look at that research assignment where it's talking about timber or talking about steel or talking about masonry, all these sorts of things. Form up separate sections and then chuck them in there. And then here we've got Australian standards, but you mentioned Australian standard people, but you can within your masonry or something you can plonk in all the relevant Australian standards in there, or even links to them or links to sections of them on the internet as well. So I encourage you to have a good look at that as well to simplify the production of that assignment.